I'm very happy, honored, and privileged to have Antonio here today with me at Classical Odyssey. Anthony, welcome. This is quite surreal to have you here. The reason why I'm doing this interviews is because I started this project a couple of years back, and it's called the Classical Agora. And so I'm interviewing mostly artists, but I want to move more into the realm of philosophy and culture as this grand category. And for those who don't know who you are, of course, I'm going to just name a few of your accomplishments, which are, of course, the tip of the iceberg. And if I read more than that, probably I'm going to lose my courage in interviewing you. But you're first of all a philosopher. You're a professor of philosophy at the University of Buckingham.
Yes.
You served as the head of the Department of Education. You're the editor of the journal Philosophy.
Well, I
You're
was.
the honorary
Yes.
director. Sorry?
I've stopped doing that after 25 years in 2019.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I have to update that. But regardless, you were also the honorary director of the Royal Institute of Philosophy.
Yes. Yes.
And you were a government special advisor on education under 3 administrations, which is quite,
Yes.
yeah, it's quite incredible. And as I said, this is only the tip of the iceberg because this is just a little bit of an introduction. And we met in Cambridge. It was a Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation.
Yes.
And it was quite an incredible event that I have terribly fond memories of.
Yes. So do I, and it was quite amazing because one of the people there was somebody I had admired for donkey's years, John Eliot Gardner, and I was actually asked to introduce him on the spur of the moment. So that was slightly unnerving, but I was very welcome, and it was a great meeting and very good to meet you. And
Thank you.
I think we had dinner with Michael Gove, actually, didn't we?
Exactly. We met over the dinner table, and you were sitting next to Michael Gove, and I was sitting next to Andrew Bailio,
Yes.
the musician. And
Yes.
it was a funny moment because I asked Michael to take a picture of us, and then Michael got up, and then Andrew said, "Do you have any idea who you asked to take a picture of you?" And I said, "I don't know who he is," and I found out too late. But I think
No,
we were also
he's been a friend of mine and indeed of Roger Scruton for a long time.
amazing.
Michael Gove.
Would you mind if I ask you? You've been a close friend of Roger Scruton. You had a
Yes.
long friendship going back.
Yes, back to the early 80s, and partly connected, but not entirely, but partly connected with going to Eastern Europe to talk to dissidents. I went to Czechoslovakia, and Roger went to Poland as well, and other people went to Hungary and even Romania, though that was pretty scary, I think.
Do you think it was the scariest? Because from what I know, Romanian the security apparatus was probably the scariest of all the
Well, I
communist
didn't
countries.
go, but yes, and actually, there's a very good book about this by Jessica Douglas Hume, who was a very almost foolhardy person who plunged her way in, and so she was really leading the visits to Romania. But Noel Malcolm went as well, and some other people, but I didn't. I just went to what was then Czechoslovakia.
But regardless, it was really rather heroic, and it's quite admirable. It's things that
it was heroic for the people who were talking to us. It wasn't heroic for us. We knew the worst that would happen would be we would be chucked out of the country, as happened to Roger, in fact. So he was chucked out of Czechoslovakia and couldn't go back until the fall of the Berlin Wall. But that was the worst that would happen to the visitors. But it was obviously very dangerous for the people who were entertaining us. And I learned a lot from them.
I imagine that experience must have been really formative also in your forming your worldview in general, your, let's say, like your own personal philosophical doctrine, because I think we all have something of it.
In a way it was, because these people were all intellectuals and artists, musicians, people of that sort, who'd fallen foul of the regime. And mostly, not entirely, but mostly they were extremely reactionary and extremely religious, quite a lot of them, not all of them, but quite a lot of them. But they all looked like hippies. and the people who wore smart suits and looked very spick and span, they were the secret police and the people governing the country. So it's a completely opposite to, they were this alleged communists. So it's completely opposite to the appearance of people in the West, actually.
Yeah, things are quite reversed, and they're historically so. The historical dynamic of the East, the former Eastern Bloc versus the West, is rather different because the continuous, uninterrupted, almost freedom in the West made people be more or less inclined, less philosophically inclined, less metaphysically inclined. And as soon as the Iron Curtain fell, I know that there was a tremendous thirst for everything related to the human spirit.
There was, and Roger wrote about that in a book called Notes from the Underground, which is a very good portrait of Czechoslovakia at the time. I mean, well, both before and after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And he also wrote the libretto for an opera called An Angel Passes, which is very moving, actually. It's been set to music by our friend David Matthews. And I won't tell you the whole story, but the point of the opera is it's about some people after the fall of the Berlin Wall whose father had been killed or died under the attentions of the secret police in Czechoslovakia. And the main character, not Anna, well, I suppose Anna is the main character, but her brother is very resentful of what's happened in Prague after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's become completely materialistic. All the values that they were cherishing and living by in the 1980s under the Soviets seem to have disappeared. And actually, some of the same people who'd been oppressing them for decades now have ran away with all the loot. And so this opera and the novel are both partly about other things as well, but they're both about what happened not during the time of oppression, but what happened after it, and the way that people were unhappy with what had, how Prague and particularly had developed, as being a kind of destination of choice for people from Britain a lot, who just wanted to get drunk and mess around.
It's the paradox of freedom, too.
Indeed, precisely. Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not saying at all that I would want the dark days back, but there were things in the dark days that these people, both in the novel, in Roger's novel, and in the opera, thought that they had lost.
It's a continuous. It's a tragedy in a sense, and there's so many dynamics here, and it just reminded me a little bit of one of my main underlying themes in my PhD thesis. It's something that I wanted to talk about more and study more, the connection between resilience and the historical memory in complex systems. Can be societies or it can be in nature. We see this path dependency. If something happened in the past, you will always be somehow determined by that initial event. And so it is, everything that you described is very universal to all former communist countries, and including Romania.
Yeah, and the line that jumped out at me, well, I've heard the opera 3 times now in different circumstances, but the line that always jumps out to me, which is repeated once, so you hear it twice, is, "When freedom came, God disappeared." Isn't that strange?
It's an incredible, really profound statement, and the more you think about it, the more truth you can grasp from it. A Romanian thinker, recent Romanian thinker, said something that I thought it was really rather profound, and one of the most defining, I think, characteristics of human nature is that unfortunately we only advance in our own humanity through suffering.
Yes.
It's almost impossible that.
Well, I think that's true. Yes. I mean, whether you're in the West, the East, or anywhere. Yes.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
and we all have to face suffering, but if we avoid it, then that is wholly unsatisfactory. But I mean, that goes right back to Plato and Socrates, because Well, the English philosopher John Stuart Mill, not something I particularly admire, but anyway, he did say something rather profound. He said, "Is it better to be a fool satisfied or Socrates dissatisfied?" And part of his point is, part of Mill's point is that if you have high ideals and if you have some sensitivity, you're bound to, if not face unhappiness, well, you probably will, but you're bound not to think you've achieved what you are supposed to achieve. Whereas the fool who spends all his time in the pub, which is nothing wrong with that particularly, but just messing around, shall I put it like that? He can, in a sense, be quite happy. So Mill is saying, well, the question is, which is better, to be Socrates dissatisfied, who of course was killed for his views, and never always refused to take any money for his teaching and so on and so forth. But also thought that life on this earth was unsatisfactory, and that's why he sacrifices a cock to us, or tells his followers to sacrifice a cock to Asclepius when he has taken the hemlock. Now, if you sacrifice a cock to Asclepius, Asclepius was the Greek god of healing. So if you were healed from a disease, you sacrificed a cock. Now, Socrates is telling his followers, when he's dead, they ought to sacrifice a cock because he will have gone to a better place and be healed from the disease which is life on earth. That's the meaning of the statement, which is in I mean, that is in Plato's account of Socrates' death.
Absolutely. When I do these interviews, I often really want to point out to the, let's say, to the sacred realm of things. And of course, I come from a Christian standpoint, and so like this system of reference for me kind of explains a lot of things in the world. And that's why I also love Platonic philosophy, and especially the Banquet. When the more I read the Banquet, the more I find irrefutable evidence for the existence of a soul, and the fact that this life here is just not enough to satisfy that which is so intrinsic to our humanity, to our human yearning for. There has to be more than this, because we see the decay of things. We see things that are not satisfactory. We have almost ingrained in our DNA the idea of absolutes and ideals.
Yes,
like, they should
definitely. But just before we get on to this, I must just tell you a slightly nicer story about Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic. Earlier this year, a young man called Martin Fallier came to see me in England, where I live, because he wanted to talk about what life had been like when we went on the Jan Hus Foundation to talk to dissidents. And that he's a very charming young man, and he was he was writing a thesis about it. That was it. And so he came and spent the day with me and my wife. And just when I was taking him back to the station to get a train back to London, I said to him, he said, "I think my father was almost certainly at one of the seminars you gave in Brno back in '87. And then I said to him, "Oh, by the way, who is your father?" And he said, "He's the Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia."
I was actually expecting something like Prime Minister, the way the story built up.
Actually, he isn't anymore. He's just lost the election, but he was. Yes. Anyway,
that's absolutely fascinating.
It was also very nice that he didn't tell me this. I had to kind of, well, I didn't drag it out of him, but he wasn't pulling rank or anything. Martin Fallier, the young man. Anyway, yeah. But let's go back to, yes, whether we all have a desire for something higher. Yes. Something that I have got rather interested in on this very point is something that most philosophers completely dismiss if they even recognize it exists, is Descartes' first proof for the existence of God. Now, Descartes says, as I'm sure you know, that his whole philosophy starts with this wholesale doubt he has. So it comes to cogito ergo sum, but you might even think of it as better dubito ergo sum. So, but he finds in this doubting, in this thinking, whether it's thinking or doubting, that he exists. But he's come to this through the realization of his imperfection because of the doubt. The doubt means that he thinks that, that there's a truth, a certainty that he hasn't got. And to that extent, and in other ways as well, but to that extent, he's imperfect. Now, so he gets to the cogito, that is, I think, which he's certain about, but he thinks and he knows that he is an imperfect being. So then the next step in the argument is, and this is I think it's in the third meditation, the next step in the argument is, if I have a notion of imperfection, by contrast, I must have a notion of perfection that the imperfection, the notion of or the sense of imperfection is contrasted with. But how could I have got the notion of imperfection except from a being that is perfect? And that being is God. So that is his first proof for the existence of God. And most philosophers just say they don't even bother to consider it. I actually think that's rather profound, that it is because we have in us, inherent, innate, if you like, in our souls, and I will use the word soul, a sense of a better world, a better life, a better reality that we are in a way in touch with and to which we aspire. And of course, this is very Platonic, and Descartes was, of course, a Platonist. So it all figures, and I think that proof merits a lot of reflection and thought.
Absolutely, and I think it's very important to for the listeners to read a little bit about the historical context in which Descartes lived, because it's marked by a lot of violence and religious conflict, and it's
Well,
from
the 30 Years' War.
Exactly, and it's the argument of suffering that makes you deconstruct and reconstruct what you're believing, because it really shatters your being, but it also gives you this clarity of thought and these small subtleties, because what you pointed out, there's something that is it's a truism. Every argument has a counter argument, and if I have the argument for this, that means that I also have the opposite, at least in concept. And I thought about it, and I had this idea in high school. I wrote it down, and then I read later on, and I discovered this. Of course, it's not new, but others wrote about it, because you have the contingency argument. But almost every single concept that we have and we operate with in any sphere of life has an empirical basis. It's something that we experience with our five senses. However, there's, I think, in my opinion, and it goes back to Ecclesiastes 3:11, that God put eternity in the heart of man. It's the idea of infinity or eternity and the idea of God, because these concepts, they surpass our own existence and our own observable universe. And just the fact that our mind has the capacity to produce a concept such as God, the cause of everything in existence, and eternity, like an uninterrupted continuum, we can't even really define it. And it's really fascinating, philosophically speaking, let's put it like that, that it's infinity as a concept is absolutely necessary mathematics.
Yes. And I think it's interesting you mentioned Ecclesiastes, because I think that there's definitely some overlap, some contact between Greek thought and Hebrew thought at that time. And so I think that what you've just quoted from Ecclesiastes is a very Platonic idea. However, I would, and you as an artist might well agree with this, I would also take issue with, well, far be it from me to take issue, but I would depart from Plato and Socrates on this point. Plato, and I don't know whether I'm talking about Plato or Socrates because the two are so intertwined, it's difficult to separate them. But anyway, Plato says that there are three stages of the appearance of beauty in our lives. The first is when the young man or woman fall in love with somebody, sexual love, that kind of maddening desire. And you find the person you love beautiful. And in this picture that Plato gives,
the eros,
yes, that's
original.
the first stage. Then I'm paraphrasing Plato now. When you escape from this madness, which is wonderful. So he's not saying that it's wrong, but when you escape from it, your sense of beauty spreads itself over the whole world, and so you see beauty in all kinds of other things other than the beautiful person you love. So that's the second stage, when your notion of beauty extends itself, over nature, over human institutions, over all kinds of things, over art as well, of course. But that's only the second stage. The third stage is when you escape from this life altogether and see the beauty of the abstract immaterial one. Now, of course, I understand what Plato is saying here, and he's trying, again, as he does so often in so many of his works, he's trying to explain his notion that this world is only a kind of temporary home for us. We've fallen from a better world into this world, and if we manage to live well, we will escape from this world into a better world. If we don't escape from it, we'll be sent back to this world. So that's the kind of picture that Plato is giving, and this. But I don't agree with that picture in the interpretation that he gives, because it seems to me, and this is where I would say that Christianity is superior to Platonism. Christianity has the idea, which I think Plato would have probably rejected very vehemently, that God becomes a human person. Now, it seems to me that if you think along those lines, then you can't just dismiss the physical. Well, you mentioned it yourself earlier, and our five senses. These are ways in which we can and do, but not always, but we can and do approach something better, but not in such a way that we would dismiss the physical appearances, in art and music and in nature and so on. So these things, it seems to me that if God has become human, then the physical world and the human physicality and so on, this must have a value which we shouldn't despise.
Absolutely. I'm very happy you brought it up, because it is one of the very important things where Christianity differentiates itself from other religions. First of all, that God became man, puts a value.
But actually, you find similar kinds of thinking, in very different ways in Indian thought, actually.
It's true. I had this summer, in my free time, I started to read a little bit about Indo-European history and studied the Sanskrit and the Upanishads, and I was very impressed about. There's a Romanian scholar and I did not know that he was considered at the time one of the greatest scholars of Indo-European history, and his name is Theophil Simensky. And he went into, he wrote this amazing book, Little Did I Expect, that it was also a little bit of Christian apologetics into it, because he had this comparative approach between the ancient proverbs from the Vedic literature, and then compared it to Christianity, and he saw like the subtle differences that actually were rather consequential in everyday life. But you're right, Christianity does put a great value on this life as well, and on the body, the material world, because now our bodies are the temples of the Holy Spirit, whereas in other religions you always constantly want to escape this, but in Christianity it is redeemed, and it's fully redeemed in the resurrection.
And actually, yes, indeed. And just to say one more point about Greek thought, I mean, I'm talking about classical Greek thought. Plato is far more hostile to the physical world in his official philosophy, although, of course, actually, he was a poet himself and was a lover of young beautiful people. But Pythagoras is far more, who Plato in some ways is following, is far more, he says that God is present in everywhere, not just in the abstract, non-physical, spiritual. So in Plato, you've got this divided line where you've got the good things, which are basically abstract and material, and then the material. But there isn't a divided line in Pythagoras. Pythagoras sees the divine in the whole world, which I think is quite interesting. At least I think Pythagoras thinks that. Nobody knows actually what Pythagoras thought, because his doctrine was secret.
Exactly. It's
but this is what people think he thought. And the Greeks, of course, people scoff at the Olympian gods, and I mean, you can understand why. But on the other hand, it is infusing human appearances with a divine splendor. And I don't think any Greeks thought that the Olympian gods were the end of the story. I think well, of course, if you take the myths, they were only the second or third lot, the Olympian gods. So there was this cycle going on, but there was something obviously, with the predecessor gods that the Olympians the Titans, the Olympians had knocked out. But sort of,
I'm sorry, that's a great, I was just thinking, so I don't lose the train of thought. It's exactly, I was just thinking about that. They did not think of the gods as being the final argument. That's why when Paul shared the gospel, he found that monument to the unknown God, because they knew there must be something even greater than that, because it's not sufficient to explain the reality.
And interestingly, in Plato, the creator God, the kind of God that creates, is only the demiurge. It's not the ultimate God.
It's true. The demiurge is a leitmotif in a lot of the, let's say, late 19th century Romanian poetry. Actually, it's very interesting. We have this, somebody called it the astro-humanistic Romanian literature, very much inspired from our, let's say, national ethos. It's, I think the archaic Romanian culture is always looking up at the stars and looking for answers always upwards. It's very kind of celestial mindset. And I wanted to bring this up because I don't want to lose track of my arguments. We're going to go back talking about the same things, but I also wanted to bring up today during the interview that you published in your book that is really beautifully called The Prism of Truth.
Yes.
In which you discuss a lot of the things that we touched upon today, and also the relevance of mythology, which is very interesting, because I think we are, there's a lot of interesting phenomena happening right now, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. There's like this Tower of Babel kind of experiment to globalize everything, and now there's kind of a counter-reactionary movement because we see this, let's say, globalism falling under or collapsing under its own premises.
Yes.
I see a lot of young people being very drawn into this kind of ancient history, going back to their national identity, but they don't go back 200 or 300 or 400 years. They go back, how far can we go? You know, where is the original argument? It's the illo tempore, as I talk very often, what Eliade said, in that time. So you go as far back as possibly, because you're looking for the mystery, the mythical origins of your own identity, because this world, the digitalized, overly cluttered world with information that is actually shallow. I think it's an interesting return to the archetypes, I think.
Yes. I mean, I think you mentioned that book that I recently wrote, The Prism of Truth, and I mean, we can talk a bit about it if you like, but one of the points that I make at the beginning is a quotation from Wittgenstein, actually from the early Wittgenstein, when he was regarded as being the kind of precursor of logical positivism. This is not really accurate. Although Wittgenstein did say in his early philosophy that everything or anything that wasn't empirically based or mathematical, basically, logical, was meaningless. But he does say that the facts of the world are not the end of the matter, and that to think that the facts of the world are not the end of the matter is to believe in God. Now, he says that very early in one of his notebooks. And I think that is a profound statement, because if you take what science gives you, which I no means do I want to disparage science, and I want to value it and honor it. But what science does is to give us an account of the facts of the world, what causes things, what is there empirically observable and investigatable. But what science doesn't do is give you any values. It doesn't tell you, well, obviously, it doesn't tell you why this world that we're examining and coming to understand scientifically, how it comes about. Does it have any meaning? Is there anything underlying it, behind it? Is there anything to which it aspires? But also, science doesn't tell us what we should do. It tells us what would happen if we do something, yes, but it doesn't tell us whether we should do that thing. It tells us that if we want to be cured from a disease, we can take a pill, if it works. And science has made, obviously, science and technology between them have made huge advances in these areas, but it doesn't tell you whether you should take. Obviously, most people want to be cured, but it doesn't. But that would be a decision they made, a value that they put on their life that isn't within the science. The science just says, if you want to do that, then do this, or if you do that, this will happen. It tells you those things, but it doesn't tell you what you should actually be aiming for, either in the big or the small. And for that, we have to go beyond science. Now, I would say this is, you don't necessarily have to be religious per se, but this is where we move into what I think you might call the human world, in the German, quite helpful German world, the Lebenswelt, the world in which we live. Now, I think another useful contrast here is given by the American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars, who was in fact a materialist, and was very much a protagonist of the scientific worldview. But he distinguished, and I think this is a helpful distinction, between the scientific worldview, which is what I've just been describing rather briefly, and the manifest image. So the manifest image is the image in which we live, in which we talk. We think people are alive, well, not just alive, but we think they're free. We think they're responsible. We love them or hate them. We feel shame. We feel honor. We're kind. We're unkind. We talk to people. We regard them as agents, not simply as being caused to do things. We see people as responsible and free, even if we know that in many ways they're not. We still treat them in that way, and we can't avoid living our lives like that. So, I mean, if science tells you that everything in the world is determined, causally determined, and there's no freedom in the physical world, well, that may be what your scientific theory tells you, but we know in the manifest image that isn't true. The manifest image, where we meet and interact with people, from the times we're babies onwards, that isn't how we see things. And I think that what we have to do to start with is to distinguish the manifest, or what's the content of the manifest image, from the scientific worldview, which I'm not disparaging the scientific worldview, but I don't think it's complete. And certainly it can't explain many things in the manifest image, which we know. And I would make just one further point, that science itself is a product of human activity. So human activity lives in, or lives in the Lebenswelt, where we have all the things I've just been mentioning, all the values and attitudes that I've been mentioning. So science itself is a product of that world. So science, being a product of that world, can't cut off that world. It can't cut off the branch on which it rests. At least that's how I look at these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really happy we're talking about this. It's a very complex issue, and it's not met with a lot of openness, especially in the academic world. From my own personal experience, it is very important to be aware and establish the limits of science. And I love that you pointed out. I mean, you described the whole thing so brilliantly. We ought not to confuse the how with the why. I mean, science explains mechanisms, and we can rely on science as long as it's repeatable. So as long as we can repeat the same experiment and obtain the same result, we can
that's right.
deduce some conclusions from it. But it is always subjected to the observer, and the observer has this amount of there's this relativism of perception. Of course, we can grasp absolute truths, not, let's say, exhaustively. We cannot know everything about everything, but we can know enough to know at least in which direction to look at for the truth.
Yes.
But science is relative to the observer, and a lot of the paradigms that we have today, they might change, and they change quite a lot. And I think
they're bound to change. I mean,
they're
I
bound
think
to change. Yes.
this is something which, well, actually, I mean, physics is in a total mess at the moment. They can't reconcile relativity and quantum theory, and they have to postulate dark matter and all kinds of things like that, to which we can't observe, of course, in order to balance the equations. And when I say it's in a mess, it's from the point of view of prediction,
it's a crossroads.
it's incredibly successful, but we don't understand the underlying reality. Now, I think that I'm also an admirer of Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, among other things. And Popper's view, Popper said that his great moment of illumination in this respect was when he was only 17 at the time in 1919, when they did some observations of a total eclipse of the sun in the South Atlantic. And this was very important because these observations were taken as providing a test case between Newton and Einstein's relativity theory. And it turned out that light was bent by the sun as Einstein predicted, and that this was something which went against the Newtonian view. So then it seems that this theory, Newton's theory, or Newton's theories, which had been absolutely astonishingly successful for 200 years, and everybody, or not everybody, lots of people thought they were the absolute truth. It turned out they weren't true. They were approximations maybe to the truth, but actually they weren't true. Things that would be ruled out in the Newtonian view were what was predicted by the Einstein's relativity. So Popper said that showed him, and he built his whole philosophy of science on this insight, he says, although he must have been a very precocious 17-year-old, but I believe it in a way. He said that his mantra was always, in science, or indeed in anything, we can't know, we can only guess. Now, we can get better guesses. So Einstein, to the extent that there was this difference between them, was a better guess than Newton. Einstein, of course, himself was always very hostile to quantum theory because he didn't like its the paradoxes and various difficulties in it. So I rather like a quotation or a statement from Darwin, somebody I have somewhat mixed views about, but Darwin said that he thinks in 500 years, people will look on his theory and Lyell's and Newton's in the same way that he looked on the ideas of the Tierra del Fuegans that he was unfortunate enough to land on their land when he was doing his voyage of the Beagle. So these were, according to Darwin, very primitive people. Darwin was actually quite rude about them, but he thought they had no arts or culture and so on and so forth. But obviously he thought they were very primitive in their ideas. But he said in 500 years, people will look on his ideas and Newton and Lyell, the geologist, in the same way that he looked on the Tierra del Fuegans, which I think was rather unkind to the Tierra del Fuegans, but still, the point I absolutely take, that in 500 years, I've no doubt that the theories we've got, subtle and amazing as they are, will be seen as, if not superstitions, at least primitive in comparison to what is known in 500 years. So I'm not skeptical of science, and I think that it has made amazing discoveries, and predictively it's astonishing. But we should beware of taking it as the truth, even in the scientific realm. And of course, not of course, but Popper also says we should beware of experts in science. Of course, there are experts, but don't be dominated by somebody's views just because he or she she says they're an expert. They might be an expert in a certain sense, but still, according to Popper, they don't know, they can only guess.
But I was also thinking about Viktor Frankl, actually, but that's in a
Yes.
completely different realm, and I really love his view, which was rather contrasting to what it was at the time offered to the patients, the quest for meaning and how deep that is, deeply human that is. And it's like everybody has that. And it's so really interesting for me to think about these things because one thing that I'm thinking very often about it, the world is full of apparent paradoxes. And one of the premises a lot of scientists have is that we need to know everything about a subject so we can understand it. You should start with the premise that there will be unknown and there will forever be a facet of reality that we do not have access to, or we will have at some later stage. And the finitude, this kind of finite argument used as a hypothesis, will limit you as a scientist. And I think that's one of the paradoxes of hyper specialization of today. You
Yes.
assume that there's a limit to your subject, and you get to the end of it, and you have your vision is blurred completely because you lose track of the larger picture. And the
Yeah.
we talked in the beginning, it's like perception. We do grasp the truth, but the truth is out there, outside of ourselves, larger than ourselves, and that is objective. And how do we experience that, and what tools do we use to grasp the higher truths? Because
Yes.
the
Yes.
material world is important, but actually what I wrote about in my thesis, and I have to explain a lot, so I don't want to postulate something grand, but the immaterial aspect of the world from a causal point of view is by far the most important aspect in our existence, because what is immaterial is actually the engine of the reality. It can be thoughts, it can be I talked about it, there's the genetic information. We talk about information is an abstraction. It is
Yes.
encapsulated in something material, but it is decoded and interpreted by certain mechanisms. And going beyond the interfaces, whatever they are in the physical world, there is this level of abstractions that we can't really fully grasp. It's almost like as simple as the thought precedes the action. Well, I think I had it, I think, in one of my notes about the fact that Leibniz argued that if you could enlarge a brain so that you could walk around it, you would discover all sorts of physical movements and impulses, but you will never see a thought.
Yes.
Because
That's
all the impulses are the effects, the thought is the cause.
yes. Yes. So I think yes. Yes. So I would be very not skeptical exactly, but I'd be very cautious of what if a dogmatic scientist tells me that thoughts are just brain activity. I'm not going to accept that because I know that thoughts go beyond and transcend. I mean, not always, of course. I mean, I'm not saying I have complete freedom or complete control over what you think, but at all. But we do have some control over it, and this is something that is very difficult to explain if you think that thoughts are only the results of movements in the brain, activity in the brain, because that is just a kind of physical electrochemical setup. Well, it's amazing, but the it's also you can't encapsulate what a thought is in purely physical terms. It requires an understanding of meaning, which and a way of thinking, in fact, which is something over and above anything in the physical world. Now, you might say, well, it has a physical basis, yes. If you don't have a brain, or if your brain is impaired, you won't be able to think. Although even that's quite interesting, that it seems that sometimes, I think this was actually discovered quite early on in the 19th century, when people started looking into the brain, that we can say that memory and I don't know, reasoning, but different mental activities, I'll say mental activities, can be seen to be mainly when they take place, certain parts of the brain seem to be operating and active. However, what was discovered was that sometimes people with large parts of their brain destroyed have managed to regain the capacities that people had said are in that part of the brain, the part that had been destroyed. So that seems to suggest that even if you look at the brain from a physical point of view, it can regenerate itself, not regenerate itself. It doesn't. The brain doesn't regenerate itself, but the activities that you thought were centered on a particular part of the brain can revive in another part of the brain. And that, I think, again, I think suggests that there is something, if you like, over and above the physical structure even of the brain. But anyway, leaving that aside, yes, the thought, language, these things are abstract or are based in abstract systems that can't be reduced to the physical material which underlies them. And I think what we have to say is that consciousness as well. I mean, if we go even lower down in a sense, I mean, consciousness itself is something that, again, depends on a physical structure, a nervous system. But the nervous system, again, the consciousness that the nervous system produces seems to be something that emerges over and above the physical physical objects, the physical material which it is based on. So I think that I would look at the world in Aristotelian terms, that there are different levels of existence, which, I mean, you've got the inorganic, then you've got life. Well, life itself is not easy to explain in terms of physics, not by any means. And people have tried and for a long time and haven't really sorted it out. Then you've got life, you've got not all living things are conscious. Consciousness itself seems to be another step beyond. And then we've got over and above our consciousness, which we share with animals, with dogs, cows, horses, and so on. Horses, you like horses, I know.
I love horses, of course.
Yeah, and they're definitely conscious, and they have minds of their own, you could say. Anyway, but they don't talk. They don't have concepts like we do. They don't know the difference. Let's say, I mean, you might be. I hope you're not too cross with your horse, but if you're angry with your horse, the horse can't distinguish between shame and guilt or remorse. It just knows that if it does this thing, it might get a slap of the whip.
However, we can never prove that.
Yes. No. So we don't know. Yeah, we don't know. It doesn't, and the horse doesn't, because it doesn't have the concepts. The horse itself doesn't have the concepts which allow us to distinguish between shame and guilt or remorse and so on. Yes, so then we've got self-consciousness. Now, I think each, as it were, higher stage emerges from the lower stage. But I think this emergence, and this is, I'm being Aristotelian now, not Platonic really, and I think this emergence is well, it's a fact, but I think it's also mysterious. So I'm not saying talking about emergence solves the problem, but it shows what the problem is. And I think that the more you look into the different levels, the more you see that they can't be reduced to each other.
Absolutely. And just to go back a little bit for those who are listening, we were talking about something that is far beyond neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. It's not just the regeneration of the structures, but it's something that we observe, like the brain is acting. I mean, we see the phenomenology of the mind at hand beyond the brain and its
Yes.
lack of certain parts. So it's like we're lacking maybe parts of the frontal or the temporal lobe, but yet the activity and the phenomena for which that area is responsible, they're still there. And this
Yes.
is absolutely fascinating, and it's something that is studied. It's not
Yes, indeed. Yes. Yes.
yeah, it's not something just a very isolated study to the sideway. I wanted to go back to the idea. I mean, it's just naturally, I think, that this idea emerges from what we talked about in regards to the tools that we have available to explore the higher realities of life, to answer the big questions of life. And there's two ideas that I wanted to just to mention because I'm curious about your thoughts. So my field of study is like complexity theory and systems, and I have this systemic approach to analyzing certain things, especially resilience in the natural world, but also human society. So I have this view of, like, for instance, let's just take the concept of beauty, which is really rather difficult to answer. And I really like the Hippias Major and the Platonic dialogues. We can interpret that as you cannot really give an exhaustive answer to beauty, like an exhaustive definition. But what I think is that when we talk about large things like beauty, truth, virtue, there's a system of reference, and we have like the systemic framework which we can use to describe, or at least to say this is beautiful and this is not beautiful. And we can have a framework instead of a definition. And I think, in my opinion, also as an artist, I think nothing trumps language. The logos, I find that the logos is the foundation for everything, and on that foundation we can build everything else, and we can experiment with the things that language has limitations. Of course, you talk a lot in the book, the Wittgenstein position on language, his early position on the topic, and then his later, probably more mature one, more
Yeah.
nuanced one,
Yeah.
focusing more on the limits of reasoning. And then Thomas Aquinas talking about how we can use language analogically, because we cannot use it in its rigid original meaning to describe the higher truths, like talk about God. Then we have all these other approaches, especially in the Eastern Christianity, the apophatic way of knowing God. We cannot say what God is. We could say what God isn't. It's
Well,
easier.
that's Aquinas actually as well. Go on.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, of course, that's true. That's true. So
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot in what you just said. I mean, I just make a point about logos. Yes, I think that there are aspects of, well, beauty that aren't reducible or explicable in terms of language. And I think of music. Music gives you insight into a world. I would even say a world which is not linguistic, and people have tried very, very hard to explain the power that music has, and the way, for many people, it opens worlds, opens dimensions of existence which seem to be infinitely valuable, but which can't be expressed in words. Indeed, if it could be expressed in words, the music would be pretty awful. So, and indeed also I would say the poetry. Of course, poetry is verbal, but you can't you can't express it, or if the poetry is any good, you can't explain in kind of literal, factual language what the poem means. If what the poem means is what the poem says, and its images may be well, very imaginative, very unrealistic in a way, but nevertheless they have a resonance and a kind of symbolic depth, which could be probably explored forever, and which maybe even the person who, the poet who actually expressed the metaphor or whatever it is in the poem to start with, maybe didn't fully realize the depth and the implications. So I'm not going to say that the word, if by the word you mean the word in a language, the literal meaning of it, I'm not going to say that that is all there is. And I'm not going to say that beauty can be explained in terms of the word in that sense. And I think, you know, if you listen to, let's say, Beethoven's last piano music, late piano music, you know, it's almost inconceivable to me. Well, first of all, it couldn't be expressed in words, but it is not just powerful, but it also, I think, is intimating to you a world, well, actually a world even beyond sound, because of course Beethoven himself couldn't hear it.
Of course, just to mention, my view is not that everything can be encapsulated. I mean, it was rather the opposite. But I feel like the word in the broader sense, and that's why I mentioned the logos, because it implies human reason, that should be the foundation, because we have to somehow be rooted in a worldview. And if we have that anchor and sort of stability, we can look for the truth at a higher level, using tools that are beyond words, such as the arts, music and visual arts,
Yes.
poetry, which is not a mechanistic process, exactly as you said, without losing ourselves. And to me, that was that's important, because it's almost like saying, I need to have a worldview first in order to have a visual philosophy in what I'm creating. When I draw something, I already have like an inner world that I constructed because of my worldview, in a sense. And language, of course, is limited, but I wanted to use the tools that I have available. So it's language and logos.
Yes.
The written word.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, like scriptures are the most important part of a religion, and then there's the Christian life and the experience of God, the actual experience of God, which is what the ear has not heard and the eyes have not seen yet. So it's that crescendo for me. It's the anchor, the foundation for truth. And that's why I think the postmodernism, it's rejecting the foundation of truth, and it's a derisory just process.
Well, yes, I mean, it's in a way, it's a childish view that can be doled up in the most complicated, meaningless, I would say, language. Yes, I mean, you know, I don't know what bit of postmodernism you particularly mean, but you know, the idea that there isn't truth; it's all interpretation. Well, try jumping off a building if you think that. I mean, I wouldn't start with any very highfalutin thinking. I would just say, how do you live? You don't live like that. You know, even if you write essays about it and talk about it endlessly to like-minded people, and people are given professorships and honours for it, actually, none of you really believe it. If you want to get on a metro, it's either there or it isn't, and you don't think that it's just a matter of interpretation. So I would really not have much time for. Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by postmodernism, because the whole term is so vague anyway.
It is. Yeah.
The idea that there isn't any truth. I mean, so I would begin with very basic truths, yes. I mean, and also, you don't really think that, I don't mean you, but one, if you're in a human relationship, I mean, you don't really think that the person doesn't have a self, that you're of sorts. It might be a divided self, all kinds of things like that, but you don't think that the person you're living with or dealing with, or the people you live with or dealing with, that they're just kind of fictions. You think they are who they are, what they are, and what reactions they have, what reactions you have to them, and so on and so forth. So when you forget about all this skepticism, this unhealthy skepticism, actually it's rather like Hume. Hume said, who I think is a profound thinker actually, but obviously his general direction of his thought was, whether he was a total skeptic or not, I'm not going to go into. But he did say, and I think this is a very healthy saying, that and Hume was a very genial chap, actually, somebody you'd enjoy being with, and who had a good sense of beauty as well. But Hume said that when he's in his study doing his philosophy, in which he says he can't find out how we come to the idea of physical objects, or he doubts that we have any knowledge that the future, or any understanding, any certainty that the future will be like the past. And he's skeptical of the self. So he's skeptical of some pretty basic things in his philosophy. But he says all these things vanish like a mist when he leaves his study and goes and plays backgammon with his fellows.
That's lovely.
Yeah. So and I think that's true. I don't think that means that you shouldn't, as epistemologists do, you shouldn't, people who are studying knowledge, philosophically, epistemologists, that is, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but and shouldn't try to find what the basis of certain fundamental beliefs is. But of course, don't allow that to seep into your life, so that you don't think that these things are real. That's what I would say. Now, I was just going to say, you mentioned. Well, no, sorry. You say what you were going to, the point you were going to make, because I'll come back to what I'm going to say.
No, it's a very short point, because it feels like one of the most difficult things in life is to find the golden middle way. The aurea mediocritas, like the Latins said. It's really rather difficult, and I think it's one of the reasons why we have these extremes in science and philosophy and social movements.
Yes.
We tend to polarize.
Yes, I mean, a lot of social movements these days, unfortunately, are based on envy and resentment. And I'm not a Nietzschean, but I do agree with Nietzsche about that. And they seem to have captured the minds of unfortunately, of people who are educated, in inverted commas. First of all, because it's fashionable, and secondly, Hayek pointed this out in the 1930s, a Viennese I do admire, that one reason why intellectuals are so attracted to philosophies of resentment and envy, which Marxism, of course, is a prime example, is because they think that they're better than they are, and they think they ought to be better rewarded than they are. And of course, once the thing gets going, then promotion and everything depends on it. What I was going to come on to was that you mentioned Aquinas' analogical thinking. Now, I think that if we want to describe, or if we want to refer to a world, or a realm, perhaps better than a world, beyond the world in which our language is at home and out of which it has kind of emerged, and the reality from which it comes, we want to describe a transcendent realm. Our language is going to be inevitably inadequate. So we can say, and if you're going to talk in Christian terms, which I'm not, of course, against, but you can say that God is just and God is merciful and God is good and these things, all these things. But God can't be just or merciful in the way that a human judge is just or merciful. And also you might have difficulty saying God is both just and merciful. Well, how do you reconcile those two things? I want to say both, but how do you manage to marry them up? So very difficult. So I think the general point is that human language is going to be inadequate to express or to describe something beyond the human realm. And that's why Aquinas says that we have to think of language in this, when we use it of God, as being used analogically, which means that, well, I think it means that we use the human word and it kind of points us in the right direction if what we're saying is true, but don't take it literally. Maybe we should take it metaphorically, though I did get into trouble with my friend and colleague Richard Swinburne for saying it was metaphorical, but I don't mind saying it's metaphorical. But anyway, both Richard and I agreed that we can't talk literally of God. But I would also say that, leaving aside the kind of theological attempt to express views about the divine in ordinary language, descriptive language, we can get insights into the divine through the myths which have fascinated and encaptured human beings from the earliest time. And that so in the book that you referred to, I try to look at religious myths as possible revelations of the divine, and what might follow from doing that. And I also think that if you want to teach people about religion, about Christianity, let's say, or any religion really, the best way to begin is by introducing people to the myths of that religion, because the myths will give you pictures, poetical pictures, which are probably infinitely expandable in terms of their implications and their resonance. And they'll also give you a kind of value system linked into that's part of the religion. So I would defend taking religious myths seriously, or at least considering what might be involved in taking them seriously. And I think that if you believe in the transcendent at all, we should be we should be prepared to think of the myths as a way of giving us insights into it, which go beyond the purely literal stroke analogical.
I almost have nothing to say. I was thinking about going back to the idea of mythology and myths, archetypes, and I find there's an insatiable appetite for that these days. I notice among some students to go back and study the things of the past and why certain things were tested by time and they survived so many centuries,
Yes.
even millennia. It's because they deal with the truth in a way that is subtle and indirect. And I think this indirectness is the best means of communication of higher truths.
I will put in a caveat. Yes, I agree, but I will put in a caveat here that the myths are mediated through human minds. So even if you think of the revelation as coming from God, which I'd be prepared to do, well, I don't mean I'm very careful, very kindly allowing this. No. But if you take the myth as coming from above, from God, it's still mediated through human concepts, human perceptions, and I think that apart from a general belief in original sin, I think that every human that there's imperfection which attends every human action, even and perhaps especially when it means to avoid it. So it seems to me that we should not be wholly unaware of places where myths that we might generally revere may go wrong because of the way that human beings have expressed the myth or developed it or applied it. And so I think that, well, I mean, a very obvious example would be the way that anti-Semitism has infected Christianity, which I don't think you could say that is implicit in the Gospels or anything like that. But it certainly has been the way that people in the Middle Ages and probably before and certainly after have interpreted Christianity, and they would claim to find bits in well, even in the scriptures, which might justify this. Well, that seems to me to be an example, and of course there are many other examples, of where a myth has been, I would say, misinterpreted by the people who follow it. So I think you've got to be aware and sensitive to the way in which, because of the way they're mediated through human minds, myths can mislead as well as lead.
But can you call that a myth? Because in the sense you refer to myths as some sort of, I would put them in a close relation to fairy tales. It's like an analogical, almost like a parable, and you can extrapolate some truths. Whereas what you mentioned, the example of anti-Semitism is false stories being spread in the
Yes.
world. So it's almost like calumny and just basic lies, which are kind of a different category. I would separate that from myth.
Well, yes, but still, yes, I agree. But it's still, it is still people who think they're living within the myth that have developed these ideas. That's my point, really.
Of course, there's always a need of we always constantly need to sharpen our discernment for everything, and that's
Yes, and you see, the myths do develop through time as well. They're never static, I don't think.
exactly the one. It's moving.
Yes. I mean, I've got a very nice remark from Tolkien, who was, of course, a great mythologizer, And he says that under God, we human beings are sub-creators, and we can then discern the refracted light through which is splintered from a single white to many hues, endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind, which I think is a beautiful way of expressing how I would want to regard myths, as refracted light splintered from a single white to many hues that move from mind to mind. Or I would quote one of the, I think, the most beautiful things that Goethe said, that this is when Faust is waking up from having been put to sleep after he's rather disgracefully abandoned Gretchen, and he's in this meadow in a mountainous country, and he sees the sun coming up, and he's absolutely overwhelmed by this, but he can't look at the sun, for obvious reasons. As Plato says, we can't look at the sun as well, but Faust can't look at the sun because it's blinding him. But he can look at a waterfall cascading down a rock, and the light of the sun being refracted through the waterfall. And the line is, and this is really where I am now, I'll say it in German, which I'm sure you'll understand, but I'll translate it then. Am farbigen Abglanz haben wir das Leben. In this reflected, colored reflection, we have our life. Im farbigen Abglanz haben wir das Leben. And I think that's right, in general, but I think also we can see one of the main refractions of this light that is too overwhelming, too blinding for us to look at. And you can think here, if you like, of Plato's myth of the cave as well. But the way the light is refracted, is splintered, goes over our world, our reality, that's where we have our life, and where we are still, through that, in touch with the divine that's too overwhelming for us to look at.
That's absolutely beautiful and brilliant, and it perfectly subsumes, I think, all the grand arguments and thoughts beyond the title, The Prism of Truth, of your book.
Well, yes, and that's why I chose the title. Yes.
That's really beautiful. And unfortunately, we will have to end, but I would like to ask a rather abstract question. And speaking of German, it was the one of the questions posed by Kant: Was darf ich hoffen? What can I hope for? And if, like, young students or students of philosophy or in the arts would ask you that question in the current state and age, what can we dare to hope for in the near future? I know it's rather abstract, but I'm mostly looking for the first thoughts that come into mind.
Well,
very spontaneous.
I think there's plenty of beauty and goodness around, and if you look for it and look at the world in a way that is going to focus on those things, you're much more likely to lead. I'm not saying you should only be searching for satisfaction, but you're much more likely to lead a fulfilled life than if you only see things in negative terms, because actually you can just look out of the window and look at the trees, well, out of my window, and look at the trees outside and the way they sway in the wind and the colors change all the time, and just the wonder of it. Of course, there are all kinds of horrible things, but turn your mind to, or to the good works of art that we can look at and listen to, and try to nourish your mind on those things. I would say, I would refer actually to the ancient Greek education that was based on music and gymnastic before you got on to reasoning about mathematics and philosophy and all those, and science and all those things. So music, things to do with the muses, and the idea of the ancient Greeks, and you find this in Aristotle very strongly, and also in Plato, but it was they were simply echoing what already existed in their culture, that until you educate your sensibility to love the beautiful and the noble, and feel shame about the shameful, and dislike the ugly, until you educate your sensibility in these ways, you're not going to be able to reason well about other things. So that's why music and gymnastic come before reasoning in the Greek system. But also, you're going to end up as a kind of narrow and bitter person. So I think that you should, and by the way, by music, they didn't just mean music, they meant things to do with the muses. So that would include literature, poetry, drama, history.